Assalamu alaikum, Brother Harris. Can you hear us?
Walaikum assalam. I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Fantastic. Okay, so I would like to introduce our next speaker. Brother Harris Irfan is joining us all the way from the United Kingdom today. He is one of the leading experts of Islamic finance. He was the former co-chair and founder of the Islamic Finance Group at Barclays. He's the author of a book titled Heaven's Bankers, which is excellent. I highly recommend it. And he is currently the founding principal and CEO of Cordoba Capital Markets, which is an Islamic finance advisory firm. So please, a round of applause for Brother Harris.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulih al-Kareem. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Just to make sure that you guys can hear me okay, is that correct? Okay, great. I have the disadvantage that I'm sitting here on my own in little old England all by myself, and I can't see you lovely people. Apparently, it's a large gathering, mashallah, in Dallas, so I'm feeling some FOMO. I must admit to feeling somewhat envious, and I wish I was there with you. The title that I've been given is The Myths of Islamic Banking. Sometimes I use the alternative titles Islamic Fiat Banking, and I say why Bitcoin is the most Islamic form of money invented and why it might save Islamic finance. So let me kick off by getting the boring bit out of the way first, which is something about the history of the modern Islamic finance era. I think if you were to go back to the 7th century, then you'd probably discover that the Prophet ﷺ was a mudarib. He was a manager of people's capital. And he entered into mudaraba arrangements, investment management arrangements with investors. So that capital would be placed with him, and he would then go out and trade real goods and commodities outside the city walls, bring them back, trade them in the marketplace, and then split the profits with his investors. So it's a real economic activity on a risk-sharing basis. And that's the essence of the Islamic economic model. So now let's fast forward to 1963, which is the first implementation of modern Islamic finance. It's in a town in Egypt called Mit Ghamr. And the Mit Ghamr experiment was essentially an Egyptian economist who implemented a profit-sharing savings institution. So he would take in deposits from local depositors, and that money would be invested in local industry, and then the profits would be shared. So that's a nice mudaraba-like arrangement. Now, then we fast forward to the mid-70s, and this time they're institutionalizing and commercializing the concept of modern Islamic finance. But this time, they have to be in line with whatever central banks and regulators and governments require in a global economy. And since they require all banks to be what we call fractional reserve institutions, where they take in deposits from depositors and they are allowed to lend more than they have in deposits. So imagine this. You deposit $1 with your bank, and that bank has the right to create new money by lending, let's say, $10 or $20. So where did the additional $9 or $19 come from? Well, literally, it's created from nothing. And this is what we call fractional reserve banking. They don't even lend your deposits. Those are just reserves. They're actually creating new money, which is interesting because later on, we're going to talk about how Bitcoin can be Sharia compliant. And people often use the example that, well, it's not real. It's not corporeal. It doesn't exist. Well, fiat money doesn't exist either when fractional reserve banks created through the act of lending. So we're at the mid-70s, and these Islamic banks have been created, but they are fractional reserve institutions. So on top of that basis, you overlay halal contracts. So they use concepts like mudaraba and murabaha and wakala and istisna and all of these other various very similar sounding Arabic words. They're essentially halal commercial contracts. By the 1980s, you had the Malaysians stepping in, and they were starting to innovate a little bit. You started to see the emergence of capital markets. And then my first brush with Islamic finance was when I was a young banker in the mid-90s. So I met Sheikh Nidham Yaqubi in 1996 at the offices of HSBC. And he was delivering a seminar on Islamic finance. So this is the first time I came across it. And a very few years later, I was working for Deutsche Bank. And Deutsche Bank placed me on the ground in the Middle East. So I was the first banker to arrive in Dubai in 2001. And of course, that was a very significant year because 2 days after I arrived, 9/11 happened. And all of a sudden, you had this massive repatriation of money from the Western world, from the US and the UK in particular, and Europe, back into the Gulf. And now Gulf markets, Gulf real estate, Gulf stocks started taking off. And you have the situation where local markets have gone a bit crazy, and I happened to be in the right place at the right time. So a lot of people came to us and said, "Hey, Deutsche Bank, wonderful that you're here in the region finally, but can you do these deals on a Sharia-compliant basis?" And so I co-founded the Islamic finance team at Deutsche Bank, and we created a financial product that had never really been created before. So if you see today sukuk transactions, what are Islamic bonds essentially, the Sharia-compliant version of a bond, you'll sort of see a watermark or a signature in the legal documentation of what we did back then, just over 20 years ago. Every sukuk in issuance today is essentially somehow an invention of that Deutsche Bank team. Similarly, any structured investment product, any hedging product, any treasury management product was invented by the Deutsche Bank team. And I documented that in a book called Heaven's Bankers, which was my sort of guide, my insider's guide to the challenges and myths of Islamic finance. And I thought that at the time that I could do something truly good and noble and useful. And by the way, my investment banking background was in project finance, which is the financing of infrastructure, railways and roads and hospitals and schools and so on. So I thought, yes, I mean, originally, obviously, I agonized over the idea of whether I should do this because one should not work in the banking industry. And I was advised at the time by a very senior person in the Islamic finance industry that if you don't do this, then you will not be able to grow from that and develop new alternatives. And what I thought I could do was to change the Islamic finance industry from within. But what I have concluded, probably a little bit too late, is that it's simply not possible. And by the time that we were well into the swing of things at Deutsche Bank, we were simply reverse engineering conventional debt-based fiat instruments. So we, for example, created what I call our own Manhattan Project. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Manhattan Project, which was the Allied scientists in the Second World War developing the atom bomb before Hitler. And we too had created our own particular atomic weapon, which was a particular type of financial arrangement called a double wad structure, which allowed us to replicate the return from any financial instrument, no matter how non-Sharia compliant it was. And we could create that in an apparently Sharia compliant format. So whilst we were following the letter of the law, we were not following the spirit of the law. And that has been completely lost in the Islamic finance industry. There's another example of that. It's something called the commodity murabaha. And it's not important to know exactly how the commodity murabaha works technically, but it's enough to know that it's a proxy for loan financing with interest, because it involves a synthetic sequence of trades of a particular commodity. It could be copper on the London Metal Exchange, for example. And you have a series of back and forths where you have different brokers and different suppliers and a different sequence of cash flows. And in the end, what happens is you're not left with any particular commodity in your hand. You're left with a loan with interest. And this particular financial instrument, the commodity murabaha, was something that was allowed by scholars in the 1980s as an interim measure to allow the Islamic finance industry to find its feet and grow, but in fact became the default form of financing for virtually all forms of corporate financing in the Islamic finance space. Sukuk, similarly, Islamic bonds are not risk sharing. They're not real economy based. All sukuk have a contract attached to them called a purchase undertaking, which is essentially a buy-bank guarantee at the par value, at the value the bond was issued, so that if you invested 100 in the bond, you would get 100 back, plus whatever coupons had been delivered according to some apparently real economy trade taking place underneath. But the whole attachment to a real economy trade, which is what Islamic finance should be all about, is in fact completely removed by adding this purchase undertaking. Because all you are now doing is taking the credit of the obligor, say a sovereign government raising $1 billion in sukuk, or Emirates Airlines raising $500 million in sukuk. You're no longer participating in the actual underlying asset or trade activity. And that's the problem with modern Islamic finance, is that it is simply reverse engineering what bonds and bank loans and structured investment products already do. It's a veneer of halalness, if you like. And so I think this idea that Islamic banks are the solution to our problems, which many scholars will tell us, it's not something that I accord with anymore. And I tried to change the industry from the inside. And I believed in the end that it simply wasn't possible. So I was delivering a lecture in 2017 on the subject of Islamic finance. And somebody in the audience asked me, what do you think of Bitcoin? And I said, well, I don't really know anything about it. It's sort of magic internet money, isn't it? And he said, well, actually, it has these characteristics. You know, it's divisible and fungible and durable and saleable across time and space and scarce and finite. And I sat and listened to this. This is the Q&A session in my lecture. I sat and listened to this and I thought, wow, this is really like gold, isn't it? But in some senses, it's potentially better than gold because it's more portable. It's potentially more secure. It's more divisible. It's less centralized. And all of these things started to add up in my mind. I guess that was my aha moment. That was my orange pill moment. And at that point, I realized it's something that I need to research because so much of what I heard about Bitcoin up to that point had been, frankly, misinformation. And it was up to me to do my own research. And so I spent my time doing that research. I'm going to come back to that point shortly, but let me go back to Islamic finance and Islamic banking. I think one of the problems that we have with the modern Islamic finance industry is that because it is based on fiat money and because it is a fractional reserve form of financing, it is by its nature high time preference. It's a model that thrives on borrow, spend, consume, borrow, spend, consume. It's not a model that thrives on saving and investment for the long term. So we live in a monetary system that encourages financialization of the economy. It leads to high time preference. It makes us want things now, not save and invest for the future. It makes us waste things. It makes us pollute the planet. It makes us throw away things that we don't want anymore. We use GDP, gross domestic product, as a simple, blunt measure of human progress. And all that it measures is exchange value of goods and services. It doesn't measure experiential value of human life. So we engage in activities that yield immediate gratification, but in the long term may be questionable. And one example I often use for that is about just under 20 years ago. No, in fact, just over 20 years ago, I was working in a team that was asked to finance one of the towers that stands in the Abraj al-Bayt project in Mecca. So if you visualize the clock tower and the 7 towers around it, we finance one of those towers. And we were the first Western bank, Deutsche Bank, invited into Mecca to finance its real estate with a capital markets issuance. And we invented this sukuk, this Islamic bond, not realizing that, in this sort of euphoria of creating this innovative, groundbreaking deal, we didn't realize we were naively participating in the wholesale destruction of our own heritage. And we may have observed the letter of the law in creating this instrument, the technicalities of fiqh al-mu'amalat, the jurisprudence of commercial transactions, but we failed to observe the spirit. And I think fiat money encourages us to engage in projects that may have questionable long-term social values. Again, we want to borrow, spend, consume as fast as possible. And this high time preference mindset is a destructive mindset. And it's encouraged by financialization and the debt-based economy. And it reduces the quality of society's output. So that's, I guess, a quick summary of why we have ended up allowing consumerism to triumph over saving and investing in long-term sustainable projects. Let me talk a little bit now about my orange pill moment and why Bitcoin scares the bankers. Imagine if we found a monetary system that encouraged deferred gratification and discouraged consumerism, a system that reduced inequality, in which institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, whose stated purpose is to develop the underdeveloped world, to improve sanitation and education and women's rights and so on, and to reduce poverty, whose stated aims are to do those, but in fact, whose actual de facto output is the opposite. It's a transfer of wealth from the global south to the global north. So in fact, these institutions, which are fractional reserve, fiat-based institutions, exist to extract wealth from those nations they claim to be helping. And what if there's, and what if there's a, sorry, I'm just getting a little bit of, is somebody asking me something? No, I don't think so. So what if there was a monetary system that was merely a medium of exchange and a store of value, instead of a commodity to be traded, instead of an instrument that was used to control other nations? The US dollar has been all powerful in extracting economic dependence from other nations around the world. It has been a powerhouse in demonstrating how it's possible to force other nations into economic slavery. And it's actually astounding to me that we are now going through a moment in history right now in the US where you have an administration that is actually advocating for the opposite, which is quite astonishing to everybody outside of the US, because it will reduce the power of the US dollar in the rest of the world, over the rest of the world. And actually gives a green light to alternative monetary systems, Bitcoin being the one that I consider to be soundest. So what is sound money? This is something I'm sure you're going to learn about a lot more. And I realize I only have about less than 10 minutes now, so I'm going to try and speed things up. I'll try and leave a few minutes at the end for questions. Sound money is one that is, as I say, saleable across time and space. It is scarce and it is finite. It cannot be manipulated. It is censorship resistant, and it is secure. And a lot of the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that you read in the papers, that you hear about from governments, from the IMF, from the World Bank, who have their own interests at heart, a lot of the FUD will tell you that it's insecure, it's used by criminals, it's damaging to the environment, it's not based on anything, it has no real basis, it's not based on a commodity, it has no guarantee from anybody. None of these things are true. None of these things are the basis of a monetary system. A monetary system is one that leads to a free market, not a manipulated one. We do not live in a free market today. We live in a highly centralized, manipulated market. And Islam believes in free markets, by the way, and the protection of property rights. It is neither socialist nor capitalist in the modern sense. We had a gold dinar standard for 700 years, during which civilization advanced in astronomy, in mathematics, in physics, in medicine, in architecture, in art and culture. All of these things were possible on a sound money standard. Whenever we've had a gold standard in history, we have seen the development of humankind. Mankind had freedom to pursue for higher pursuits. And today we're in the pursuit of money, of the US dollar. And as a result, we have massive inequality, not just within our own countries, the US and UK are good examples of that, but across the world, the global north and the global south. So this is something that I think Bitcoin actually has a solution to. And people then ask the question, is Bitcoin Sharia compliant? Well, I tell them that all the arguments that have been put forward by Sharia scholars are simply based on a misunderstanding of how the monetary system and the financial system works. So they often talk about Bitcoin has no government undertaking. Well, the US dollar has no government undertaking. The only thing that backs the US dollar is the threat of military violence. If you decide you're no longer going to sell your oil in US dollars, prepare to be invaded and assassinated. That's how it works. I think there are other arguments that scholars will use. Typically, they use the argument of there being no commodity backing, because they argue that gold is real, it has a real purpose. Well, it's a shiny metal rock. We only give it value because people assign value to it. It's not intrinsically valuable. Its industrial usage is tiny. That in itself does not give it the value that we ascribe to it. So there's no such thing as intrinsic value. Money is a medium of exchange. Money doesn't need corporeal essence to be real. The digits in your bank account are simply electronic bits and bytes in a computer. They're not real. You don't hold them in your hand. And yet that's real money. You don't actually own that money, by the way. The bank And that's another reason why I advocate for Bitcoin, because you can own your own Bitcoin. You are your own Swiss private bank in your hand. And fiat money doesn't give you that. If you want to donate money to people dying in Gaza, you can't do that through the banking rails, but you can do it through Bitcoin. If you want to protect your wealth against inflation in Lebanon, you can't do it through the Lebanese pound, but you can do it through Bitcoin. Bitcoin is Islamic economics because it's low time preference. It's investing for our akhirah because it's long term and sustainable. And we are people who believe in the hereafter, not the here and now. We are low time preference people. We shun mindless consumerism. We don't want to live in a world of financialization. We believe in disciplining our nafs, our ego. We fast for 30 days of Ramadan. We pray 5 times a day. We are disciplined people. We inculcate sabr or patience. We encourage free markets. We condemn and correct inequality. We believe in a real economy model with real goods and services and real value creation and real job creation, risk-sharing financial arrangements, sanctity of property rights, amana, freedom from state interference. The market and the ruler should be separate. This will destroy crony capitalism. That's why I believe in Riba, in Bitcoin, because it's anti-Riba, it's anti-financialization, and it's anti-inflation. So I'm going to end there and give hopefully 5 to 10 minutes on Q&A. I don't know if there are specific things that you guys picked up on that you'd like me to talk about more, and I'm happy to go into those, or whether there are other questions that you wish to ask.
Jazakallah, Brother Harris. So I'm going to walk over to some attendees who have questions. We'll start with the brother here.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Harris. Thank you for that.
Alaikum salam.
It was very intriguing. So my question relates more towards the World Bank and IMF. I know there's countries trying to adopt Bitcoin strategic reserve model like El Salvador and the president, I believe, Nayib Bukele.
Sorry, could I I apologize. I've got an open line here, I think, with the admin team, and I'm getting their sort of conversation. So I'm struggling to hear what you're saying.
Okay, I'll start the question again. So I know there's countries trying to adopt Bitcoin strategic reserve model or are adopting it, like El Salvador, and they're getting threats, or they'd get threats from like the IMF. I know you brought up the World Bank and IMF. I come from Somalia, and recently, actually a year ago, we had our debt forgiven through the World Bank and IMF through their Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Act. So our GDP went from, or debt to GDP ratio went from 60% to 6%, which, although Somalia has perceived poverty, I think that sets us up for something similar to El Salvador is doing. My question is, I understand why banks feel threatened by individuals, but why does IMF feel threatened by countries? I actually recently met with the former president of Somalia, and I was trying to get him to adopt the same model because he's running for re-election. And so I guess my question is, why do these organizations such as IMF and World Bank get threatened, and how is the wealth extracted from the global south to the north specifically?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I believe there are people in the IMF and the World Bank who are sincere and well-meaning people. And actually, a number of Muslims work in IMF and World Bank, and they believe that they're doing something good in the world. Unfortunately, the empirical evidence is the opposite. The institutions themselves, let me give you an example. President Sisi had $6 billion approved as an IMF loan at the beginning of last year, and almost immediately started building a concentration camp in the desert outside Rafah. And I am not prepared to believe that that was coincidence. I believe there are strings attached whenever you take money from the IMF. Pakistan has been to the IMF 24 times, ostensibly for the reason of shoring up its finances, preventing economic turmoil. But every single time it's been to the IMF, 24 times, it's got poorer. So the empirical evidence is the opposite of what the IMF claims that it does, which is to empower and develop the underdeveloped world. I see examples of strings attached every time the World Bank and the IMF does something, which tells me that these are instruments of US dollar hegemony. They are designed to ensure that you borrow as a poor country in US dollars. You earn in your local currency, which is weak. You end up paying more and more interest to the point where your interest repayments to the IMF and the World Bank are greater than any other expenditure, including healthcare, education, whatever it is. So you end up becoming an economic slave, specifically to the US and also to the EU and UK and other developed nations in the world. This is not a fair exchange. This is a reallocation of wealth from the poor to the rich.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. Thank you for your insight. I really appreciate it. I just had a question regarding, you mentioned sending money to Palestine, like being able to send money to Palestine with Bitcoin. But on October 7th, after October 7th, Binance had shut down, I think it was about 10,000 Palestinian accounts where they couldn't extract their Bitcoin out. So my question to you is, if you can't do a Bitcoin to Bitcoin transaction, how is it feasible to be able to send money over if they can't extract it? Because they can always stop you at the end, right? So if it's not like if the world doesn't adjust to Bitcoin transaction, how is that feasible?
Yeah, that's also a good question. I think if you go through the exchanges, you're going to have a problem. And almost all exchanges nowadays still require KYC, so that's always going to be an issue. The only solution that we've had to date, the only real solution, has been peer-to-peer transactions. And that does require knowing somebody on the ground and a network of effectively halal money changers, if you like, who are there to be able to change Bitcoin into either US dollars or shekels or whatever currency. So there is this unfortunate phase at the moment where we are relying on a network of trusted people on the ground.
Yeah, so I think I'm thinking more along the lines of like, if you're not able to buy bread in... Oh, hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So if you're not able to buy bread in Bitcoin, if you're not able to buy water in Bitcoin, I think that's what I'm thinking along, like more like day to day, because Palestinians, like that's some, like they need some more like very, not really, they just need more like not like the resources, right? So if you're not able to buy those things, how is it more like, what's the solution to that?
Yeah, I think this is a sort of a continuation of the last question. I mean, as I say, there are people on the ground who can change into local currency, and we're not at the stage yet where we have widespread adoption of Bitcoin and Bitcoin wallets amongst everybody in the population. If we had that, then sure, there wouldn't be any problem. But I think we're on the way to getting that. People are starting to wake up to this reality that this is a form of money that doesn't need banking rails or money changers or intermediaries. It's something that we can just transact between us. You're quite right. Today, it's not possible. You can't reach 2 million people on the ground, each with their own individual ability to receive Bitcoin and trade in Bitcoin. And so there is an interim stage that we are at where we have to rely on a trusted intermediary.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Harris. Thank you so much for your voice and for all the effort that you've been doing. For me, your voice in several podcasts that you have done has given me confidence when there's been a lot of doubt. From the Islamic scholars, as Muslims, we always look up to our scholars and take guidance from them. That's what they're here for in our world, to help us in our deen. But
I do apologize. I'm getting quite a lot of echo. So if you could just like slow it down, and I don't know if you're maybe hold the microphone closer. I can pick it up more clearly. Sorry about that.
Alhamdulillah, thank you. So I started by just saying thank you for your voice and for the podcast that you have done, because it's helped me as a Muslim. When there's been a lot of doubt. By the way, is it better now? The audio?
Yeah.
Okay. I was saying that there's been a lot of doubt, and as a Muslim Bitcoiner, not understanding if it's halal and things like this, because of our Islamic scholars. I think they've said certain things that have made it seem that it's doubtful. So you've had interactions with Islamic scholars because you said that when you were in the banking system, your first I think interaction was with a scholar. I'm just curious to understand what you've understood from them as to what is their doubt about Bitcoin, and why are they not in the forefront? I want them to be in the forefront if truly this is the way to go, because that's what the Muslim Ummah is. They're looking to them, and as long as they're not on board, I think it's hard for Muslims to adopt and adapt to and to understand. I think. Right.
I think that's a very good question. What I'm finding is that there is a generational divide taking place at the moment. We've got a lot of the sort of old school scholars who perhaps they have a lot of trust and reliance on, I don't know, or association with incumbent governments and authorities, and feel that it is also, a sunnah to obey the ruler. Which is correct, of course, and therefore they will justify a monetary system that is imposed by a ruler, hence fiat, by decree, as being one that is halal. And they don't really look beyond that. And this generational divide is, you got young scholars who are at the coalface of not just fiqh al-mu'amalat, but also in commercial organizations, founders in their own right, entrepreneurs in their own right, who have analyzed Bitcoin as a form of money from first principles, not based on what they read in the newspaper, right? They have analyzed it from first principles and said, can this legitimately be a form of money? Does it have the characteristics of mal, of taqawum, of thamaniya? Does it have these characteristics? Yes or no? If it does, then it is money. Then we can use it as money. Then it's halal. So I think there's this generational divide. And I think also that scholars are, we have a history of scholars being a little bit slow with new technology. And I often seem to cause controversy when I talk about the printing press, because there are a number of ulama today who say that wasn't the fault of the scholars that we didn't adopt the printing press, that was the rulers in Ottoman times. But I think there's sufficient evidence to show that scholars were a factor in our failure to adopt the printing press. And we got left behind as a result. Scholars debated telegraph poles and telegraph wires. They said it shouldn't be sited near a mosque because it conveyed the voice of shaitan. They've done the same thing with loudspeakers and television and other forms of technology. So what happens is that the people will end up using this technology and the scholars will then follow suit. And I hear what you say. It is helpful to have scholars on side and saying we've analyzed this from first principles and we believe that there's something good here potentially, and we're prepared to put our name to it. But I sometimes feel that prudence gets the better of them, and they want to be overly conservative and they don't want to move the game forward because there's too much to lose. They're human beings as well. They're like us. We don't want to change our jobs. We don't want to move out of fiat and into Bitcoin. It's a big risk for us. We're earning a nice salary, a good wage. It's said that, it's difficult to get a man to understand a thing when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. This applies to scholars as much as anyone. They're human beings like us. So I would say, for me, I evangelize Bitcoin as much as I can. And if it catches some scholars, great. If not, hey, doesn't matter to me, as long as the people adopt it.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Irfan. Great talk. Thank you for enlightening us on the overall Islamic banking and stuff. In your talk, you mentioned a couple of times about, following not just complying the letter of the law, but also the spirit of the law. You gave an example when you were in Duce Bank about the Mecca clock tower, and one of the clock towers were financed by your bank at that time. I'm curious about what you would do now. How would you do it differently? Because you mentioned that it did comply with the letter of the law, but however, it was not the spirit of the law. So if you had an opportunity, how would you go by doing that fully being with the spirit of the law as well? Thank you.
Okay. I'm so glad you asked that question because it gives me an opportunity to blatantly plug my company. I founded a company called CCM, Cordoba Capital Markets, and we set up a type of we created a financial instrument called a PPN, a profit participating note. So typically when you see companies financing their activities on stock exchanges, they either issue equity as shares, or they issue debt, typically in the form of bonds on an exchange. And sukuk were always meant to be a real economy based type of bond. So it pay you a regular coupon based on some underlying activity, and you would return your capital to you at maturity. And as I said earlier, it never really participated in underlying activity. So what I did was I went back to the roots of Islamic economics, which is mudaraba, which is this investment management arrangement. So the mudarib takes in capital, he manages that capital, and he returns it to investors after participating in some underlying economic activity or asset. And you could argue, well, that's equity, right? That's shares. But actually it's different because what we're doing is we're allowing investors to participate in a specific trade. Let's say that was steel. Right? So you're not exposed to all of the equity of a company and all of the activities it does, but just to the gross profits of that specific activity. So it's as if you're saying to investors, you buy this note, this profit participating note, you participate in some underlying activity, and we return the capital to you having paid some periodic coupons which are related to the performance of the underlying asset. So that's true Islamic economics. Now, the next step would be, and we're not at this stage yet, the next step would be, how do we now convert this idea of a PPN, the true sukuk, if you like, with a Bitcoin monetary standard? Because now you have Bitcoin as a hurdle rate, and that's sound money, and it's anti-inflation, and it's anti-financialization. That's kind of the end game for what we're trying to do. And for the time being, we're doing it in a TradFi format. An international financial center, which is Jersey, one of the Channel Islands. It's a regulated instrument. It's listed on an exchange in Europe. These are all things that we expect institutional investors to see when they buy a financial instrument to invest in. But we want to get to the stage where we go digital and we go Bitcoin. And that is something for the future, I think. So that's the direction that we're heading in. It's real economy. It's risk sharing. This is the essence of the Islamic economic model.
We're going to have to conclude on that note. So Jazakallah, Brother Harris. We'll collect additional questions from the audience and we'll share them with you, and inshallah we'll get those answered for everybody.